The morning the turkeys arrived was a Tuesday in late May, 1998. The air was already thick and wet, the color of dishwater, promising a heat that would settle in your lungs by noon. I remember the sound of the truck coming up the county road, a low gear-whine that meant a heavy load or an old engine, and in this case it was both. A flatbed from the hatchery 2 states over pulled in, and the driver, a young man with a sunburn already peeling on his nose, handed me the manifest. 80 poults, heritage breed, they're chirping a thin, frantic sound against the hum of the cicadas just starting their long summer drone. He looked at the manifest, then at me, then at the calendar page tacked inside my barn door. He didn't say anything, but the look was enough. It was the same look I'd be getting for the next 6 months. By noon the diner had a version of the story, and the version had grown. 80 birds was a hobby flock. 80 birds in late May was a mistake. Commercial growers start their poults in March, April at the latest, to make the Thanksgiving weights. Starting them now meant they'd be half-grown, maybe 10 pounds, when the processors were paying top dollar in November. It was simple math, the kind they teach you at the co-op seminars. It was the kind of math everyone in the county understood. My neighbor, Jed, drove over that afternoon. His truck was a year old and still smelled of the dealership, a silver four-door so clean you could see the reflection of my rusty fence line in its panels. He leaned out the window, didn't kill the engine. The air conditioning bled out into the heat. "Heard you got some birds in," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded toward the brooder pen I'd set up in the old milk house, where the 80 little birds were huddled under the heat lamps, a sea of twitching brown fluff. 80 of them, I said. He chewed on that for a second. He's a good man, Jed, but he is a man who trusts a spreadsheet more than he trusts the sky. He believes in what's been proven, what's efficient, what scales. That's a late start, he said, polite as could be. Planning on Christmas market? It was the only logical out he could offer me. The Christmas market was smaller, the prices less certain. It was a gamble. I just looked at him. "I'm farming," I told him. That was the only answer I had. It wasn't an answer he could put in a column on his spreadsheet. He nodded, a slow, pitying kind of nod. "Well, good luck to you," he said, and the automatic window hummed shut, sealing him back inside his climate-controlled certainty. He put the truck in reverse and rolled away. I stood there for a long time, listening to the sound of the poults. They were fragile things. You could lose half of them to a cold snap or a wet floor. Raising them at all is an act of faith. Raising them on a schedule that every expert and neighbor knows is wrong feels like something else entirely. It feels like tempting a failure everyone has already predicted for you. I didn't know yet what the birds knew. And I hadn't yet found the courage to open the notebook my father left me. I knew it was sitting in the bottom of the old cedar chest at the foot of my bed, but I wasn't ready to face what was in it. Not yet. Because what was in it was either the reason I was a fool, or the reason everyone else was wrong. And on that hot May afternoon, the odds felt pretty firmly on the side of me being the fool. The feed store manager was even more direct than Jed, though just as polite. When I called to put in my order for starter crumble, he took down the quantity and then paused. 80 birds, you said? That's right, another pause. Starting them now? I could hear him tapping a pen on his desk. I could picture him in his clean plaid shirt, a phone wedged between his ear and shoulder, looking at a wall calendar with all the key dates circled in red. Planting dates, harvest dates, processing dates. The rhythm of the modern agricultural year. My request didn't fit the rhythm. Yep, I said. You know, the last truck to the big processor leaves the week before Thanksgiving, he said, his voice helpful, instructional. They won't take anything under 16 pounds dressed. You'll be lucky to get 12 pounds on these birds by then, and that's if you push the protein. Your feed conversion is going to be way off. He was just trying to save me money. He was trying to save me from a mistake he'd seen dozens of other men make, men who got a sentimental notion to do things the old way without understanding the economics. I thanked him for the advice. I told him to send the feed anyway. There was a long silence on the line, and then he said, "All right. It's your ticket." He meant it was my gamble. My funeral. The whole county runs on a kind of shared, unspoken wisdom. It's a wisdom born of hard winters and dry summers, of market crashes and diesel prices. It's a conservative wisdom. It says you don't fix what isn't broken, you don't plant what the co-op won't buy, and you don't raise animals you can't sell at the proper time. I was breaking all three of those rules at once. And I knew it. But there was something else I knew, a memory from when I was a boy, a quiet lesson my father had tried to teach me not with words, but with a walk up on the south ridge of our property. It was a memory that felt more real than the feed manager's numbers or Jed's clean, new truck. That was my real reason. It wasn't sentiment. It was a bet. A long, slow bet on a piece of ground everyone else, including me for most of my life, had written off as useless. My father was not a man who wasted words. He could spend a whole day mending fence and the only thing you'd hear from him was a grunt when he strained against the wire stretcher. He taught by showing, not by telling. He believed that if you paid attention, the land would tell you everything you needed to know. The South Ridge was a place we mostly ignored. It was 30 acres of steep ground, thick with hickory and white oak, the soil thin and rocky. You couldn't get a tractor up there, and the forage was poor for cattle. They'd wander up, find nothing much to eat, and wander back down to the bottom pasture. To my father, a piece of land that couldn't be hayed or grazed by a cow was a problem he hadn't solved yet. He used to say, "The ground is never wrong. Only the farmer's question is." One afternoon in late October, I must have been 12 or 13, he told me to follow him. We walked up the South Ridge. The air was sharp, smelling of wood smoke and decaying leaves. The first hard frost had come through the week before, and the canopy was a blaze of rust and gold. He didn't say anything for a long time. We just walked, and he'd stop every so often, kick at the leaf litter with the toe of his boot, and stare at the ground. Finally, he pointed. "See that?" he said. The ground was littered with acorns and the husks of hickory nuts. The squirrels had been busy, but there were still thousands of them carpeting the forest floor. "That's fat," he said. "That's finishing fat. Different kind of fat than you get from a bag of corn." I didn't understand. To me, it was just nuts. It was squirrel food. Fat carries the flavor, he told me, his voice low and serious. But the ground decides the fat. You remember that, that was it. That was the whole lesson. We walked back down in silence. He never mentioned it again. He died 5 winters later, and the memory faded, becoming just another one of those strange, half-understood things an old man says. It wasn't until that spring, when I was cleaning out the old milk house to get it ready for the turkeys, that I found the notebook. It was in a wooden crate with some old veterinary supplies and a set of rusted wrenches. A marbled composition book, the kind you'd use in school, its corners soft and rounded from years of handling. His name wasn't on it. He didn't need to write his name on his own things. His penmanship was inside, a careful, blocky print in pencil that had gone faint and brown with age. I took it back to the house that night. I sat at the kitchen table under the single bare bulb and opened it. It wasn't a diary. It was a ledger of work. Page after page of dates, weather notes, planting depths, feed ratios, calving records. It was the practical memory of a man who trusted paper more than his own mind for the details. He recorded failures as plainly as successes. Corn plot number 3, North Field. Too wet. Yellow by July. Total loss, or, got 2 ton/acre off the alfalfa. Dry June helped, I read for hours. It was like hearing his voice again, terse and practical, across the years. And then I found the page. Near the back. The heading just said birds. He'd experimented with chickens, with geese. And for 2 years, he'd tried turkeys. The notes were dense. He tracked their feed intake down to the ounce, their weight gain, their mortality. He tried different breeds. He was searching for something. Most of the entries ended with a simple summary: sold at market. Broke even, or lost money. Feed cost too high. It was a record of commercial failure. He was trying to make the math work, the same math the co-op manager had quoted me, and he couldn't. But at the bottom of the last page, there was a different kind of note. It was written in ink, not pencil, as if it were a final thought he wanted to make permanent. A summary of all his failed experiments. Weight is not the same as worth, he'd written. And underneath that, underlined twice, acorns finish different, and beside it, a final, cryptic phrase with a question mark. Check South Hickory Ridge after first hard frost. I sat there, staring at that page, and the memory of that afternoon walk came back so clearly it felt like he was in the room with me. He hadn't just been showing me nuts on the ground. He had been leaving me a map. He had run the experiment with the numbers and failed. But he suspected there was another way, one that wasn't on the spreadsheet. A way that depended on the ground, on the season, on a different kind of fat. He had never gotten to run that final experiment himself. The question mark told me that. It was an open loop. A question he had left for someone else to answer. I'll own that I had found that notebook years before. I'd read that page and felt a little spark of understanding, but I'd put it back. I wasn't ready. My own farm was all about the spreadsheet then. I was busy trying to make the modern math work, buying the inputs the experts recommended, chasing the yields they promised. I was listening to everyone except the one man who had understood this specific piece of ground. That night, holding the notebook, I felt a quiet shame about that. I had the map and I'd left it folded in a drawer. The arrival of those 80 turkeys was my decision to finally unfold it. It was a decision to trust that quiet afternoon walk, to trust my father's tired hands that wrote that final question, more than I trusted the polite certainty of my neighbors and the proven logic of the market. It was a long shot. But for the first time in years, it felt like I was asking the land the right question. The first few months were a slow, methodical grind. Summer settled over the valley like a wet wool blanket. The days were long and hot, the nights barely cooled off. The turkeys grew, but it was a slow, deliberate growth, nothing like the explosive development you see in commercial birds bred for rapid weight gain. I kept them on pasture from the time they were old enough to be out of the brooder, moving their electric netting fence every 2 days. It was a constant rotation across the bottom fields, the best ground I had. They had fresh grass, bugs, clean water, and a supplemental ration of starter grain. It was a life a factory bird could never dream of, but the numbers were stubborn. I kept my own notebook, just as my father had. I weighed the feed every morning. I did a sample weighing of 10 birds every Sunday evening. The math was not encouraging. By early August, they were healthy, fully feathered, and active. They were beautiful birds, bronze and iridescent in the evening sun. But they were lean. Jed stopped by one afternoon, leaning on the fence as he always did, his truck idling behind him. He watched the birds foraging in the clover. "They're looking good," he said, which was his polite way of opening the conversation. "Healthy, they're doing all right," I said. "A little on the small side for this late in the summer, aren't they?" he asked. He wasn't being cruel. He was being practical. He was looking at my flock and seeing a balance sheet that didn't add up. "They should be close to 15 pounds by now if you were pushing the feed." "You're maybe hitting 10, I'd guess." He was right. The heaviest tom in my Sunday sample was 9.5 pounds. "I'm not pushing the feed," I told him. "Letting them forage more," he nodded, and that look of quiet concern settled on his face again. "Forage is good for them," he said. "But you can't take forage to the bank." The processor pays for weight, not scenery. He was quoting a line from one of the co-op seminars. It was the gospel of modern efficiency. And he wasn't wrong. I was spending real money on feed, on fencing, on my own time, and the return on that investment, measured by the only metric the market cared about, was falling behind schedule every single day. Doubt is a quiet thing. It doesn't shout. It whispers. It would come to me in the middle of the night, or in the heat of the afternoon when I was hauling water out to the pasture. Was I just being sentimental? Was I chasing a ghost, a half-remembered conversation, and a cryptic note in a dead man's ledger? Was I confusing a fond memory of my father with a viable business plan? My own numbers seemed to confirm Jed's gentle skepticism. The cost of the grain was piling up. The weight of the birds was lagging. Any rational farmer would have cut his losses, sold the birds for whatever he could get, and written the whole thing off as a failed experiment. Every night, I'd sit with my father's notebook and my own. I'd compare his columns of figures from 50 years ago with my own. His results with grain were the same as mine. He'd failed to make the numbers work that way. That, strangely, gave me a little comfort. I wasn't failing because I was a worse farmer. I was failing the same way he had, by trying to win a game that was rigged against this kind of bird on this kind of land. But his experiment hadn't ended there. His ended with a question mark. Mine was still in progress. I was in the part of the story that was all cost and no profit. The part that everyone could see and judge. The next part, the part that depended on the South Ridge, was still just a theory. An old man's hunch. I held on to his words. Weight is not the same as worth. I had to believe that there was a different kind of value being built in those birds, a value that wasn't showing up on the Sunday evening weigh-in. A value that came from walking, from foraging, from a varied diet of clover and grasshoppers and wild seeds. A value that was, for now, invisible. It was a hard faith to keep. The summer wore on, each day a copy of the one before. Move the fence. Fill the waterers. Measure the feed. Watch the sky. Watch the birds. They were teaching me a different rhythm. They were not in a hurry. They were building themselves slowly, deliberately. My job was not to rush them. My job was to get them to the first hard frost. My job was to get them to the acorns. Everything depended on it. The whole county was watching, waiting for me to quietly admit my mistake. And the only thing I had to offer in my defense was a page from an old, faded notebook and a trust in a piece of ground everyone else called worthless. The change came in late September. It wasn't dramatic, not at first. It was a subtle shift in the quality of the light, a coolness that lingered in the shadows after sunrise. The nights grew colder, dipping into the 40s. The cicadas fell silent. The crickets took their place. And on the South Ridge, the acorns began to fall. At first it was just a few, knocked loose by the wind or a climbing squirrel. Then, after a week of steady, cool nights, the trees began to let go in earnest. I remember the morning I decided to move the flock. It was the first day of October. A low fog was settled in the valley, but the sun was breaking through, backlighting the golden leaves of the hickories on the ridge. I had been waiting for this signal. My father's note didn't give a date, it gave a condition. After first hard frost, we'd had that frost 2 nights before, a light, silvering frost that crisped the edges of the pumpkin leaves in my wife's garden. It was time. It took me most of the morning to move the fencing and the water line up the steep grade of the ridge. It was awkward, heavy work. The ground was uneven, catching my boots. More than once I stopped, breathing hard, and wondered if I was a complete fool, hauling all this equipment up to a place with such poor grass. By noon, I had a 5-acre paddock fenced off, encompassing a dense stand of white oak and shagbark hickory. I opened the gate to their old pasture and began to herd the 80 turkeys up the slope. They were hesitant at first. The ground was new, the trees thick. But then the first bird, a big, curious tom, discovered an acorn. He picked it up, juggled it in his beak, and swallowed it with a toss of his head. Then he found another. A low, excited purring sound started to ripple through the flock. It was a sound I hadn't heard from them before. Within 10 minutes, the entire flock was fanned out across the forest floor, scratching in the leaf litter, their heads down. They were no longer walking. They were working. They completely ignored the feeder of grain I had hauled up the hill for them. I left it there, full, as a control for my experiment. I needed to know if they were choosing the acorns, or if they were just eating them because there was nothing else. The choice was clear. For 3 days, they did not touch the grain. They were harvesting. From dawn until dusk, they moved through the woods in a slow, deliberate wave, scratching, finding, swallowing. The sound of their feet in the dry leaves was a constant rustle. The only other sound was the soft thud of acorns dropping from the canopy above. I spent hours up there, just sitting on a log, watching them. It was like watching a different animal. On the grass pasture, they had been placid, almost lazy. Here, they were alert, energetic, focused. They were performing a function they had been bred for over centuries, a function that had been lost in the world of commercial barns and scientifically formulated feed. They were finishing themselves on the mast of the forest. My father's words came back to me. That's fat. Finishing fat, I began to understand. He wasn't talking about the thick, white, subcutaneous fat that comes from a diet of corn and soy. He was talking about something else. A marbled, intramuscular fat, rich with the oils and minerals of the nuts they were eating. A fat that would build flavor, not just bulk. I kept my records meticulously. Every evening I'd note how much they had foraged. I couldn't measure the acorns, of course, but I could measure the grain they weren't eating. My feed bill dropped to almost zero overnight. They were living off the land, off the gift the trees were giving. The only cost was my own labor in moving the fence and the water. On Sunday, I did my weekly sample weighing. I was nervous. They were so active, I worried they might be burning more calories than they were taking in, that they might be losing weight. I carried the 10 birds, one by one, to the scale. The first one, a hen, was up a full pound from the week before. The second, a tom, was up nearly 2. Every single bird in the sample had put on more weight in that 1 week on the ridge than they had in any 2-week period on the grain. The math was finally starting to work. But it was a different kind of math. It was the math of the forest, not the feed store. It was an equation that added the value of the forgotten ground back into the balance sheet. Jed drove by one evening in mid-October. He didn't come up the drive. He just stopped his truck on the road and looked up at the ridge where the birds were. He could see them moving through the trees in the long evening light. He sat there for a good 5 minutes, the truck idling. He didn't wave. I didn't wave back. We were just 2 farmers, on 2 different sides of a fence, watching 2 different ideas of what a farm was supposed to be. He finally drove on. I knew what he was thinking. He was thinking I was a stubborn old fool, hiding my skinny birds up in the woods so no one could see how far behind schedule they were. He couldn't see what was happening. He couldn't see the slow, patient miracle of the acorns. He saw worthless ground. I was beginning to see the most valuable pasture I had. Thanksgiving came and went. The week before the holiday, the county roads were busy with the big trucks from the regional processor, going from farm to farm, loading up the flocks. The lights of their loading crews would cut through the pre-dawn darkness. It was the harvest. It was the time everyone had been working toward since March. My phone rang a few times. Neighbors, checking in. "Did you get your birds out?" they'd ask. "Nope," I'd say. "Still have them," a confused silence would follow. "You missed the truck?" "Didn't plan on being on it," I'd say. The conversations were always short after that. The co-op manager called on the Monday before Thanksgiving. "Just doing a final check," he said, his voice full of professional courtesy. "Wanted to make sure you didn't need a last-minute contact for a smaller processor. Sometimes they have room for a few extra birds." He was trying to help me save face. He was offering me a way to get rid of my failed flock without having to admit defeat publicly. "I appreciate that," I told him. "But I'm holding on to them for a while longer." I could almost hear him shake his head through the phone. "All right then," he said, his voice now tinged with the resignation of a man who has done all he can for a lost cause. "You know where to find us if you change your mind." I felt a pang of self-doubt after that call. The entire agricultural world around me was operating on a rhythm I had abandoned. Every farmer I knew was cashing their check from the processor, their barns were empty, their work for the year was winding down. My work was not. My 80 birds were still up on the south ridge, getting fatter by the day. The ground was now bare of acorns. The great drop was over. The squirrels had taken most of what the turkeys had left. But for 6 solid weeks, from the 1st of October to the middle of November, that flock had lived on a diet of almost pure mast. They were heavy now. When I did my weigh-ins, I had to recalibrate the scale. The toms were averaging over 24 pounds, the hens around 16. They had surpassed the Thanksgiving market weights, but the market was now closed. I had 80 enormous, expensive to keep birds and no buyer. This was the heart of the gamble. My father's note said, "Weight is not the same as worth." I had the weight. Now I had to find out if it had a different kind of worth. The first week of December, the weather turned. A hard, cold front blew in from the north, bringing with it the first real snow of the season. The world went quiet and white. I moved the turkeys down from the ridge and into a sheltered pasture behind the barn with a simple hoop house for shelter. Their foraging days were over. I put them back on a light ration of grain, but their appetites were small. They were finished. They had a deep, satisfying heft to them. When you picked one up, it felt dense, solid, like a bag of packed sand. The fat on their breasts and backs was thick, but it was a creamy, almost yellow color, not the stark white fat of a corn-fed bird. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that they were something special. But I was the only one who knew it. A product has no value until a buyer agrees on a price. And my market, the one everyone understood, had vanished 4 weeks earlier. I spent my evenings in the barn, under the single light bulb, reading my father's notebook again. I had followed his map. I had answered his question mark. The experiment had worked. But he had left no instructions on what to do next. There were no notes on marketing, no contacts for specialty butchers. He had been a man of the earth, not of the marketplace. That part, I realized, was up to me. I had to finish his work. I had to build the bridge from the forgotten pasture to a paying customer. It was the last, and perhaps the hardest, part of the puzzle. The whole county thought I was stuck with 80 oversized pets that would eat me into bankruptcy before the new year. And as the snow piled up against the barn door, I had to admit that if I couldn't find a buyer, they would be right. There was a man 2 counties over named Albright. He ran a small, state-inspected processing facility that had been in his family for 3 generations. He didn't deal in volume, he dealt in quality. He was the man the high-end restaurants in the city called when they wanted heritage pork, grass-fed lamb, or game birds. He had a reputation for being honest, quiet, and incredibly particular. If he didn't like what he saw, he'd just say, "Not for me," and drive away. He wouldn't haggle. He wouldn't negotiate. His standards were his standards. I found his number in an old copy of a small farm journal. I called him on a Tuesday morning. The snow was still on the ground, bright under a cold sun. I told him who I was and what I had. 80 heritage turkeys, I said. A little late in the season, I know. I could hear the skepticism in his silence. "What have they been on?" he asked. It was the first question the co-op manager should have asked, but never did. Pasture all summer, I said. And they finished for 6 weeks on hickory nuts and white oak acorns. Another silence, longer this time. I thought he might have hung up. Then, I haven't heard of anyone doing an acorn finish in 30 years, he said. His voice was flat, giving nothing away. My grandfather used to do it. I'd like you to come and see them, I said. I'm a fair ways out, he said. It wasn't an objection, it was a statement of fact. He was testing my confidence. I think it would be worth your time, I said. He was quiet for another moment. I'll be there Thursday morning. Around 10-inch, and he hung up. For the next 2 days, I was a wreck of nerves. I felt like a boy waiting for the county fair judge. I double-checked the birds, the pasture, the barn. Everything had to be right. Thursday morning arrived, clear and cold. At 10 o'clock exactly, an old but immaculately clean blue pickup truck pulled into my lane. It wasn't new and flashy like Jed's, but it was cared for. It was a work truck that was respected. Mr. Albright got out. He was a small, wiry man in his late 60s, with hands that looked like they'd been carved from wood. He wore clean overalls and a worn flannel jacket. He didn't offer to shake my hand. He just gave a short nod. Let's see them, he said. We walked to the pasture behind the barn. The turkeys were out, scratching in the snow, their bronze feathers shining in the sun. They were magnificent, strutting and displaying, full of vigor. Albright stood by the fence for a long time, not saying a word. He just watched them. He observed their movement, their condition, the way they carried themselves. Then he said, "Open the gate." I did, and he walked slowly into the flock. The birds parted around him. He singled out a big tom, a bird that had to be close to 28 pounds. He didn't chase it. He just walked toward it calmly, cornered it against the fence, and picked it up with an practiced ease that was startling. He held the bird under one arm, his other hand expertly probing its body. He felt the breast, running a thumb down the keel bone. He checked the fat layer over the back, along the thighs. He spread a wing and looked at the feathering. He did all of this in a profound, unnerving silence. I just stood and waited, my heart pounding. This was the moment. The judgment. He put the tom down, and it rejoined the flock with an indignant gobble. He walked back toward me, wiping his hands on his overalls. He stopped in front of me and looked not at me, but at the south ridge, its trees bare against the winter sky. I could see him connecting the land to the animal. He was reading the story. Finally, he looked at me. His face was unreadable. "Exceptional," he said. The word was quiet, but it landed with more force than any shout. It was the vindication. It was the proof. "The fat is yellow," he said. "It's from the acorns. You can't fake that. That's real flavor." He finally looked me in the eye. "What do you want for them?" "I need $4 a pound, dressed," I said. It was more than double the Thanksgiving price. It was an audacious number. He didn't flinch. "That's a fair price for a bird of this quality," he said. "I'll take all of them. My city chefs will fight over these for the New Year's menus. We'll process them next week. My truck will be here Monday morning at 6-inch," and that was it. The deal was done. No haggling, no spreadsheets, no talk of feed conversion ratios. It was a transaction based on a different kind of value. A value he could feel with his hands and see in the color of the fat. A value that came from the ground, from the trees, from a question asked in a notebook 50 years ago. As he got back into his truck, he paused with the door open. "Your father's place, isn't it?" he asked. "Yes," I said, surprised he knew. He nodded. He was a good man. Stubborn. But he paid attention. Then he got in, started the engine, and drove away. The processor's truck came on Monday, just as he'd promised. It was still dark, the air so cold it hurt to breathe. The loading went smoothly and quietly under the glare of the truck's work lights. By the time the sun came up, the pasture was empty. The silence was immense. The work was done. A few days before Christmas, Jed drove by again. He saw the empty pasture, and this time he pulled into the lane, rolling his clean truck to a stop beside my barn. He rolled down the window. The heater blasted out into the cold air. "Saw the birds are gone," he said. "Sold them," I said. "Good for you," he said. He was trying to be gracious. Must have taken a bit of a loss, though, having to feed them all that extra time. It was the opening he'd been waiting for since May. The chance to have his polite, data-driven worldview confirmed. The chance for me to finally admit he had been right all along. "They did all right," I said. I didn't offer any numbers. I didn't need to. The quiet confidence in my own voice was enough. He looked at me, then his eyes drifted up to the south ridge, stark and skeletal in the winter light. He held that gaze for a long time. I could see the wheels turning in his head. He was a smart man. He was starting to do a different kind of math. "Huh," he said, more to himself than to me. "My grandpa used to talk about acorn birds. Said you couldn't get a taste like that from a bag." He looked back at me, a flicker of something new in his eyes. Respect, maybe. Or at least, the beginning of a doubt in his own certainty. He just gave a single, slow nod. "Well. Merry Christmas," he said. He rolled up his window and drove away. That was it. That was the victory. It wasn't a big, triumphant moment. It was just a quiet nod on a cold December morning. It was a small concession that maybe there was more to this business than what was taught in the seminars. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with my father's notebook and my own. I laid them side by side. His was full of questions and trials, ending with that hopeful, uncertain question mark. Mine was full of the daily record of answering it. I wrote one last entry in my book. December 21, 1998. Birds sold. Paid in full. Then I added the line my father had taught me, the line that had been the invisible foundation of the whole endeavor. The ground decides the fat. It was never about the turkeys. Not really. It was about learning to read a piece of land. That south ridge wasn't worthless pasture. It was a finishing parlor. It was a tool, a very specific tool, that was only useful for about 6 weeks a year. But in those 6 weeks, it could create a value that you couldn't buy from a feed store at any price. My father knew that. He didn't have the time to prove it, but he knew it. He left the map for me. He trusted that someday, someone would have the patience to follow it. Patience. That's the part the modern world forgets. We want everything fast, efficient, predictable. We want a recipe that works the same way every time, no matter the soil, no matter the weather. But the land doesn't work that way. The land has its own rhythms, its own secrets. It gives its gifts on its own schedule. And you can't harvest a gift until it's been offered. All I did was pay attention. I listened to a quiet conversation from 40 years ago. I trusted a question mark in a faded notebook. And I gave the birds and the land the one thing they needed to prove the old man right: time. The difference between a problem and a lesson is only whether you were paying attention. That 30 acres of steep, rocky ground was a problem for my whole life. But it turns out it was just a lesson I hadn't learned yet. It taught me that the best things are often slow. That worth is not the same as weight. And that the most valuable inheritance isn't land or money, but a well-phrased question, left for you to answer. If you've got your own piece of stubborn ground, your own overlooked flock, or an old piece of advice from your own father or grandfather that the world told you to ignore, I'd like to hear about it in the comments. And subscribe if this meant something to you. There's a lot of wisdom out there that doesn't come from a spreadsheet. We just have to be quiet enough to hear it.